Hello and welcome to Chetan Bharat Learning, and in this class we're going to do current affairs for international relations for the third week of December, all right? So there were some very interesting developments this week with respect to international relations, and it was quite a hectic week for international relations. So we chose these three important stories that we're going to cover. First and foremost, expect a question on the role of Indian diaspora in India's foreign policy. And what we're going to do for Indian diaspora today is we're going to place the role of Indian diaspora in India's foreign policy in a historical as well as a political context, all right? So it's very difficult to just memorize or absorb the things that Indian diaspora does with respect to India's foreign policy if you look them in isolation from what has been happening over the past couple of centuries, all right? So we're going to do that quintessential job of placing it in a context, and then we're going to try and understand how does that historical role correlate with what we do with respect to our diaspora in current times, all right? The second thing we're going to look at is the Open Skies Treaty. Russia has recently exited that. We're going to look at the provisions and again place that in a geopolitical context. And then we're going to understand the equation that we have with Oman, right? India-Oman relations. You can expect a question on that also. All right, so let's begin with diaspora and India's foreign policy. This article is what really brought this on. It was in a Hindustan Times editorial, a beautifully written editorial, very concise, not very expansive, just raised the important points. And then like a diaspora has been a continuing theme all throughout the last year. Nirumama Subramaniam raised her objections as to India's diaspora diplomacy, and then we saw farm laws, the diaspora's take on that, Citizenship Amendment Act, the diaspora's take on that. So there is something happening, all right? And because there is something happening, this becomes important from your exam perspective, and even besides exam perspective, this critical part of India's history with respect to its diaspora is usable in whatever exam that you ever write, all right? So let's get to it. Some of the flash facts, the idea behind flash facts is that what are the facts that you encounter on the face of it when you try and embark on the process of trying to understand this topic, right? So some facts really stand out. Right, for example, according to the Global Migration Report, it was an annual UN report that comes out. It said that It said that India continues to be the largest country of origin for international migrants. It puts the number at 1.7 crore people, which is a very strong diaspora. The estimates by Ministry of External Affairs put the number at more than 3 crores, right? 3.21 crores is the Ministry of External Affairs number, which is much bigger, all right? So then the economic aspect of it is just quite mind-boggling, to be honest. Like the remittances that India has received is at $78.6 billion, all right, which forms 3.4% of India's GDP, right? That's how important it is. So these people of Indian origin living outside of India are making it are making themselves indispensable to the Indian economy, right? Then Indian diaspora comprises of 6.4% of the total global migrant population. So for every 100 people that sort of migrate out of their birthplaces, outside the country of their birth, 6.5 people, right? 7 people out of that are Indians, right? Then United Arab Emirates overtook United States as the largest destination for Indians. And over the past 25 years, right? Over the past 25 years, this great globalization that took place from 1990s onwards, the opening of borders and service economy and all of that led to too many Indians leaving the country, right? So over the past 25 years, the migration has more than doubled, right? Indian migration outside of India has more than doubled, all right? So that's a critical fact that you must understand. Now we're going to do this historically, right? So broadly, Indian people leaving the country can be grouped into two broad migrations, right? The first migration was the Germithiya Migration. Now, what does that mean? These were Indians. So what happened was in 1833-34, the British Parliament abolished slavery, right? There were some beautiful movies based on that. You can look them up. So when British Parliament abolished slavery, although the French had done it earlier, the demand for cheap labor just shot up across the world, right? Especially in colonies, in British colonies in the Caribbean, in Africa, and the East Indies, right? The Southeast Asian region, right? Even all the way up to, right, Hong Kong and Singapore, right? And those regions. So the demand for cheap labor just shot up drastically. And to meet that demand for cheap labor, Indians were transported to these regions from Bihar, Bengal, Odisha, Jharkhand, and like even in the south, right? And because a lot of these Indians who sort of moved to these regions did so under coercive circumstances, right? The word Germithiya is a corruption of the word agreement, because these people were forced to sign these agreements and sort of sent abroad. So these agreements were coercive in nature. Many of the provisions were fraudulent, and the circumstances in which these people found themselves outside the country were very heinous, right? Were very close to slave labor, and they were overworked, underpaid, and like kept in conditions that were worse than what they were in India, right? So this was the first migration, and this happened broadly from 1870s onwards to early 1900s, right? And this migration is important from an India's own historical perspective. Why? Because Indian National Congress's political stand on these on the conditions of these people living outside the country has always been an important one, right? So, for example, Gopal Krishna Gokhale made it an active political promise of the Indian National Congress to better the conditions of people living in these countries. Gopal Krishna Gokhale led Congress, actually sent missions abroad to study the conditions in which these people were living, right? One of the father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi, pretty much honed his skills of non-violent assertion against the rulers in South Africa, right? A Germithiya country. So you can understand how Indian National Congress's relationship with these countries, with Indians living in these countries, has played an important part in the India's independence struggle. All right. So then the second wave came after the independence, right? In the post-independence era, this wave could be broadly sort of segregated into two groups, right? The first was the skilled personnel, right? IT and professionals like lawyers and accountants and academics who sort of went to North America and Europe, right? Many prominent Indian academics sort of fled India at this time. And then the second group is the semi-skilled and unskilled labor that found its way to the Gulf region on the backs of a booming oil market or the oil economy of these regions. They needed cheap labor. So you can understand how the demand for cheap labor has always been satisfied by Indians across the world, even to this day, right? So there are so many people living in the Gulf region, right? So you can broadly classify these migrations into these two groups, right? The first migration led to the term of persons of Indian origin, right? And the second migration, in popular culture, the term is non-resident Indians, right? NRIs. However, NRIs are technically something very different, right? There's a 180 days cutoff, and if you're an Indian citizen not living in India for more than 180 days, then you're considered a non-resident Indian, an Indian who is resident somewhere else, right? But in the popular culture, all of these people are sort of grouped as NRIs, right? So in popular culture also, you can see that people who migrated in the first wave are not considered as reputed as the people who migrated in the second wave, all right? So, as I've just told you, the differences between these two waves, right? So, then this is important, all right? So what happened was the Congress platform was very concerned about the conditions on which these people, under which the Indian migrant labor was living, immigrants were living there, right? So what they did was they sent these study missions abroad, right? And these study missions understood their conditions and came back and reported back to Congress. And Congress came to certain conclusions about why Indians faced institutionalized discrimination from the state as well as the indigenous peoples in those countries, right? And the conclusion that they came to was that India was not an independent nation. That's why this was happening. Because earlier, before all of this, Indians sort of campaigned for equality under the empire, right? All the petitions that landed in London from these regions said that we are equal members of the British Empire. So how come we are being discriminated like that, right? But that pretense of equality under the British Empire, because like in the nature of things, the British must humiliate Indians to rule over them, right? So when the pretense of equality under the British Empire was sort of set aside, the conclusion that the Indian National Congress reached was that because India was a colonized nation, that's why it could not really respond to the needs of a people abroad. And in the popular literature of that time, comparisons were frequently made to China. So even though China was sort of a subdued state, a state whose sovereignty was not up to the mark, was like pretty much tied down by obligations by the British Empire, even that nation frequently made noise about the conditions of Chinese living abroad, especially in Japan and Southeast Asia, right? It took care of them in the ways that it could. And India couldn't do that, right? So what was the argument that was made by Indian National Congress? That as soon as we become an independent nation, we would be willing and able to address the plight of Indians living abroad. So that was the platform on which these people living outside of India were roped into the Indian national movement, right? Especially Sikhs from Canada and Europe, right? In Los Angeles area, those people who were part of the Ghadar movement also, right? So this is the context in which these people participated in the Indian national movement on the hope that once India becomes an independent entity, it would be able to play a more prominent role in ensuring the welfare of the people living abroad, right? But then what happened was, post-independence, although initially there were some signs that India was actually going to make good on its promise. So what happened was, there was certain General Smuts in the 1950s, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa, the apartheid regime, who was also a general in the British Army earlier. So at that time, India sort of made very loud noises at the United Nations General Assembly about the discrimination against Indians living in South Africa. And so at a point, it seemed like India is going to make good on its promise. But then clearly and consistently, India just ignored people living abroad, right? And it was argued that it's because of state capacity, right? And the independent India is barely able to look after its own people. How could it possibly look after people who are not even living in India, right? But the makers of modern India sort of gave that an ideological rubric, right? So what was the ideological argument that they made? They said that these Indians who are living abroad, so they said that we are a colonized country, and there are many post-colonial countries in Africa and Asia, right? So just as India would not like any interventions from the foreign world into how it deals with its own citizens, these countries abroad would also not enjoy if India suddenly told them this is how you should treat your citizens because they're of Indian origin, right? So that's the sovereign argument sort of became popular, right? So this was the ideological rubric in which India sort of cloaked its state incapacity, right? So because we couldn't do it, we said we are ideologically sound and we don't want to interfere in other countries' internal affairs, right? So this was the ideological background, right? So if I could draw your attention to these points, right? So, in 1957, Jawaharlal Nehru stood in front of the parliament and said that the question of Indians living abroad has now been successfully and amicably resolved, right? And what does he mean by resolved? He says the Indians who were living abroad are now at crossroads, right? They need to decide what is the decision that they have to make. They could choose to claim Indian citizenship and they could become a part of the independent India. And as Indian citizens, if they're living abroad, they could not really expect anything more than favorable alien treatment outside the Indian territory, right? That's the most they could get, right? Favorable alien treatment, a very vaguely worded phrase, right? So people said it just means that we're going to do whatever we could, don't expect more, right? And I'm going to give you examples to sort of enunciate that. But if those Indians choose the nationality of the country that they're living in, if they go for the citizenship of that country, then the Indian state wished them well, we wish you all the luck, and try and become good citizens of that country, right? So that was this choice that was sort of given to them, right? Like, if you choose, we can't do, if you choose us, we can't do much because you're living outside, and if you choose them, then like good luck there, right? So it's a very it's very weird position to be in, right? And because of this position, the diaspora was sort of cut out of India's foreign policy. They played a minimal role in India's foreign policy, right? And sovereignty was made the paramount condition of like our dealings with these post-colonial societies became hinged on this sovereignty principle that allowed us to sort of stay away from our from local Indian populations there, right? This ideological rubric emphasizing the respect for territorial sovereignty led the Indian state to simply ignore the plight of people living there, right? This was also labeled as benign neglect, right? The Indian policy of benign neglect of Indians living abroad, right? That's how it was termed, right? So some have argued that this policy was actually a blunder. Why was it a blunder and a missed opportunity? Why? So because this diaspora could have been a valuable economic resource for this newly emerging nation, right? We sort of just let that go, right? And as I've told you, virtually non-existent role of the diaspora in shaping Indian foreign policy. Now I really want to draw your attention to some examples, right? So for example, the first one, the most important, the test case for India's foreign policy with respect to people of Indian origin living abroad was Myanmar, because in the early 1950s, Myanmar, much like India did in the 60s and the 70s, Myanmar started nationalizing existing private businesses, right? And a lot of those business houses were owned by Indians, right? So the Indian government pretty much told the Myanmari Indian businessmen that we are also on the same trajectory in India, so you can't really expect us to do much there, because we support that they can nationalize their country's economic resources as and when they please. Who are we to tell them not to do something or to do something? So if you want to come back to India, we'll open our gates to citizenship, but we can't do anything more than that, right? So this was India's response to the Myanmari crisis. Then East Asia also became a very important test case, because under Idi Amin's regime in Uganda, local shopkeepers in major cities of Uganda, Indian businessmen were pushed out, and India sort of accepted them with grace again, said, all right, do whatever you can, we'll accept these people as our own citizens, right? And then there was a coup in Fiji in 1987, after which India made some representations actually, but still did not go as far as tell the other country as to what they should or should not do, right? These issues, again, all these issues came up in Parliament, and the stance of the government of India was clear that we are not going to intervene officially, all right? So it became the official policy that we are not going to intervene, right? So throughout this phase, right, up till the 80s and late 80s, right, Rajiv Gandhi brought about some changes in outlook, right? So he started, so whenever he went to a country, he started meeting people of Indian origin more publicly, but even that didn't go so far. It was just like a tinge of a change, right? So then came liberalization, and the Nehruvian framework of import substitution and a closed economy was disavowed publicly and authoritatively. And when that was done, that opened the gates of the economy to Indian diaspora, right? People of Indian origin living abroad, right? So this marked the official re-entry of the diaspora as important actors in public and political discourse. This is important, right? People started speaking of NRIs as important, right? There were these debates in the Indian Parliament during the time where where honorable members of Parliament openly questioned the idea of allowing NRIs to sort of invest in India. They openly said that the narrative was that this is brain drain. These people have left the country, are fleeing the country. Why are you so concerned about them, right? So after the gates of the economy were opened and India suddenly seemed a little more susceptible to participation of NRIs in India's economy, the residents living abroad formed this global organization of people of Indian origin, GOPIO, right, in 1989, and recommended to the Indian government that an Indian, and then an Indian caucus in the United States House of Representatives was established. As powerless as it may be, it sort of symbolized or tokenized the arrival of Indian diaspora in the United States on the political stage, right? So this, they also sort of then recommended the PIO scheme, Persons of Indian Origin scheme, to the Indian government in 1990s only, right? But then there were some critical junctures, right? There were some very critical junctures that really brought the idea of NRIs intervening in Indian affairs home, right? And what were these junctures? The first one was the 1998 nuclear blast, right? We conducted Pokhran tests, and after that, United States imposed these crippling sanctions on the Indian economy, right? And the people who stood fast, right, with India's interests and sort of mitigated the impact of these sanctions were Indians living in the United States, right? Senior diplomats like Ashley Tellis and others of his kind, right? They sort of lobbied the United States House of Representatives and sort of ensuring that they understand the Indian perspective, understand the China challenge and all of that, right? And then to mitigate the economic impact, Indian government floated something called the Resurgent India bonds, right? And these Resurgent India bonds were actively subscribed by people living abroad, right? So again, you could see that these interventions proved critical in ensuring that India has a stable economy, which some argue, like there were some books like Crossing the Rubicon by C. Rajamohan and all of those guys who argued that this was actually a part of the calculus of the BJP government at that time, that even if there are sanctions, we can take them on because of our active diaspora in the United States, right? So then GOPIO, which sort of earned its relevance, right, recommended to the Indian government that they want a persons of Indian origin card. They should want to hold a card saying that we are persons of Indian origin, right? So then what happened was, Indian government appointed the Salem Singhvi Committee, officially called the High Level Committee on the Indian Diaspora, and it was set up in 2000. And now this is where I want you to sort of understand things, right? So if you really want to understand the possibilities of what diaspora could do or could mean to a country in its domestic affairs, think of Eastern European countries, right? After their integration into the European Union, people of these Eastern European countries started working in countries all over the Europe, right? All over the European Union. Now, in their domestic elections, the diaspora becomes the critical part, right? The diaspora starts shifting the electoral gears, right? So if these 3 crore Indians are suddenly made a part of Indian politics, think of the impact it might make, right? And that's the difference between a state and a nation, right? A nation is people. It's an imagined community which does not necessarily stick to territorial boundaries, right? A state must have a territorial boundary. The nation does not need to, although it's a critical element of it. Like if you have a territorial boundary, a state can easily a nation can turn into a state, but territorial boundaries are not important for a nation, right? So Indian nation as such, theoretically at least, could include people of Indian origin living abroad, right? Kurdish nation, think of the Kurdish nation, think of the Jewish nation, right? Think of the Turkish nation, the Turkish immigrants living all over Europe, right? So these people are part of Indian nationality, and so they should feature in India's thought process, right? That was the brief for LM Singhvi Committee, right? So the problem that the LM Singhvi Committee had was that Indian Constitution does not recognize dual citizenship, right? So if the Indian Constitution does not recognize dual citizenship, then because only citizens are entitled to political rights within our domestic politics, these people who are living abroad, who are not NRIs, who are persons of Indian origin, could only be granted some non-political rights, right? So that is what the LM Singhvi Committee sort of recommended. It said, let them hold a card, right? A card carrying member of the persons of Indian origin, right? So it said, let's have a PIO card scheme, right? Let's celebrate a Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, and let's give out awards to persons who sort of work themselves to acclaim an international community, right? They win a Nobel Prize or some other prize, or become an important diplomat of Indian origin, or things like that, right? So these were some of the suggestions that it made, right? So then what happened to the PIO idea? The PIO idea continues to be the central plank of India's relationship with people living abroad, right? There was a Citizenship Amendment Act in 2003, and this is important. They amended the Citizenship Act. They could have done this through an executive order. This was not just a regular scheme, right? This was legislated upon, because the Constitution gives the Parliament the power to legislate on citizenship matters, right? To grant or take away citizenship. Now, the Parliament amended the Act, right? And said that now there is going to be an overseas citizenship of India there's going to be an idea of overseas citizenship of India, and 16 people of Indian origin from 16 countries could be a part of that scheme, could be overseas citizens of India, right? Now, this wasn't really a citizenship, because citizenship involves by definition political rights, right? So this was more of an economic citizenship, right? You have some you have some leeway, right? You can come into India openly, you can invest here and stuff like that without much regulatory hassle, but no political rights, because Constitution of India does not allow so. Right, so that's why many scholars refer to this as the pseudo-citizenship idea, right? So this is an important part, all right? Then in 2005, the Citizenship Act was again amended to expand the scope from 16 countries to all over the world, right? 2015, the nomenclature Overseas Citizen of India was replaced with Overseas Citizen of India card holder, and there was this OCI scheme which was merged with the PIO scheme, all right? So there's this very narrow, very like focused attempt through a card holding idea, right? Then what does the OCI card do? It does pretty much the same thing, right? It's effectively a long-term visa, right? If you hold that card, you can come into India from multiple entry points. You can stay here. You are exempted from police reporting it for any length of time that you stay in the country. And your rights are in parity with non-resident Indians only with respect to economic matters, not political matters, right? That part I just could not emphasize enough, all right? Then there is the economic element of diaspora. As I've told you, the remittances that are coming into the Indian economy from diaspora is equivalent to 3.4% of India's GDP, right? When a foreign minister visits any country in the West Asian region now or for the past 1 year, the topmost priority is ensuring a smooth return of Indians living, Indians who worked there earlier, right? Because that remittance earning is just like is whopping amount, right? So then the idea, not just that remittance earning, Indian diaspora is actually one of the richest communities in developed countries, right? A Pew poll said that 2.8 million Indian persons of Indian origin are the most educated and richest minority in United States, right? And even the less skilled or the semi-skilled or the unskilled members of the diaspora who work mostly in West Asia and now to an extent in Canada and Australia, these people also are solving the problem of disguised unemployment in India, right? There's a, I hope you understand what disguised unemployment is, right? Read up on it, right? If there is a farm field and it could do with 2 workers, there are 4 people working on the same field, right? So that's disguised unemployment. Now that doesn't happen, right? Because of the diaspora. Right, and then now there's a lot of talk about diaspora being roped in on the Atmanirbhar Bharat idea. Now there's an Atmanirbhar Bharat idea is that self-reliant India, right? Some say it's a revert back to the Nehruvian policies of import substitution and all of that, higher tariffs and all of that, but others say it's a positive idea that wants to ensure that Indian manufacturing is at par with international competition. And so there are 2 working streams. So you want to rope in NRIs, right? Because there could be important technological inputs that come in, right? People who are CEOs and leaders in United States and European countries of their own tech ventures could sort of help in. So they are trying to rope in NRIs. There's this ironical element that in the 1990s when Narasimha Rao roped in NRIs, he sold the idea of an opening economy to them. Now we're selling them the idea of a closing economy, according to some scholars, right? That's just an opinion. Right, then this element of soft power is very important. These people present or sort of project culture in these countries, like Indian cuisine, Indian culture, namaste, yoga, and all of that, right? So they become the ambassadors of Indian country, right? In those countries, right? That ambassador idea is very important. They've been, and because of this ambassador idea, because of these existing groups of Indians who are already there, they help us in executing what is called diaspora diplomacy, right? So these people are instruments of soft power. Think of the Jewish diaspora, you would understand, right? The critical intervention that the diaspora in United States made during the Indo-US civil nuclear deal, I've already touched upon that. The diaspora diplomacy part is conducting diplomacy with the government institutions of that nation through based upon the diaspora. That you have in that country is diaspora diplomacy. That becomes very interesting with respect to transferable vote banks. We're going to come to what that means, and that is the crucial element that I want to turn to, right? after this slide, right? And then there are top political positions that Indians hold across world, like international institutions as well as government institutions, who are very favorable to India on most accounts, right? So now there is a very strong argument that is being made that diaspora diplomacy, which has always been a positive for India, could be a double-edged sword, right? How is that a double-edged sword? One, when the Citizenship Amendment Act was being passed through the parliament, a lot of Indians in the United States actively stood against that and voiced their opinions which were antithetical to India's interests, right? So our own diaspora, which we sort of hope that would always align itself with the official policy of the Indian government, suddenly started opposing India's policy in Kashmir, right? However, there was a counter narrative within that diaspora, right? There were people who were actively helping India do it, but now we saw the dissension, right? This diaspora could oppose your actions, could lobby the United States House of Representatives against your actions. And this became very visual in Canada, right, against farm laws. The diaspora in Canada pretty much lobbied the entire government structure in Canada to align their foreign policy against us, right? The Prime Minister openly said things that were against our farm laws, right? Which contradicted their own position on the WTO forum on farm subsidies, right? Their official position on farm subsidies is that India should liberalize its agri market, right? And the Prime Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister, sort of let that go and said like we are with farmers, right? Pretty much indicated that. So you could see how the diaspora, Indian diaspora living in Canada, opposed India's policy decisions, lobbied a foreign government successfully to change their foreign policy stance on this issue, right? How important that is, right? So now this is dawning on us that we should be very careful in dealing with diasporas, right? Because they could be a great help while you're trying to advance your interests, and we have really thrusted upon that pedal. They could also sort of undercut your interests, right, if they don't agree, right? So there's a double-edged sword involved. And in this context, transferable vote banks become important, right? What are transferable vote banks? Right? So there are many Indians living in the United States who are affiliated, who have organizations affiliated with Bharatiya Janata Party in India, right? And these organizations sort of actively campaigned for a particular party, the Republican Party in the United States, right? We had these Howdy Modi events, and we had the Madison Square Garden event. But during the Howdy Modi event, according to scholars, the Indian Prime Minister in effect endorsed the US president, right? So he tried to transfer the Bharatiya Janata Party's vote bank in the United States over to the Republican Party. And this is again according to some scholars, all right? So when that happens, when there is a transferable vote bank involved, there are problems that could arise if the person in opposition wins the elections in that country, which happened, right? Joe Biden won, and many scholars say that this might become a problem for India, right? In United Kingdom also similar thing happened. Labour Party's position on Kashmir was very antithetical to the government line that India took, and there was a very strong Indian community in United Kingdom that strongly lobbied against the Labour Party and aligned itself with the Conservative government. The Conservative Party, the Conservative, and who won, right? The Boris Johnson won. So in United Kingdom, well and good, but up till the time he's in power, right? Because the Labour Party isn't going to forget that we did that, right? The people of Indian origin did that. So this double-edged sword part of diaspora diplomacy is what you must absorb, because this is something that you could be quizzed on properly, right? There could be a proper 15 marker and you would be asked to organize your ideas. So you have to use these examples, and I hope you will be able to write a good answer, right? And how are you going to end this? Because with an attempt of Indian government to institutionalize our engagement with the with the diaspora, right? First and foremost, like transparency has been an important issue especially for missions abroad, that they need to be very open and transparent as to what are the policies in pipeline, right? Suddenly a scheme should not be announced. However, that's not as important a point. There is a definite need for an evacuation policy, right? Indian government should say beforehand. Some argue, right? Although there are very strong arguments against having an evacuation policy, because it is an executive prerogative. From what regions you decide to evacuate persons of Indian origin and from what reasons you don't is an executive decision that is taken based on the exigencies of that particular circumstance, right? So there should be no policy as such. There should be no open policy as such. Some argue that there should be a policy so that people could decide which areas to go to and which areas not to go to, right? The United States sort of flags, like it declares this country is too dangerous to be in, this country is too dangerous to be in. Indian government should also not just declare such advisories, have an official policy regarding that. That's been one of the demands, right? Then we should improve, it's a very intuitive point, if we improve the ease of doing business, the foreign direct investment or institutional investment that comes in via the Indian diaspora will be enriched and enhanced, right? Then there are some very important Indian ventures, right, on which we are actively seeking help from the diaspora, right? For example, Swachh Bharat, Clean Ganga, Make in India, Digital India, Skill India. We're actively seeking help from the diaspora on these fronts, right? Look at your notes and just understand each of these programs, right? These could be asked in your prelims, or generally you could cite these as example, and you should know that this is all that India is doing, right? There's a No India program, Swadesh scheme for for persons of Indian origin who want to come back and contribute. There's these rescue operations that have become very important, right? Pravasi Bharatiya Bima Yojana, Mahatma Gandhi Pravasi Suraksha Yojana, Indian Community Welfare Fund, and a bunch of other things, right? So what is the takeaway? The first is the fact that diaspora is historically what has been diaspora's role in the Indian foreign policy. It's important to know. Then the economic impact of diaspora's of diaspora in India, 3.4% of India's GDP, disguised unemployment, all of that you should know. Then you should be able to sort of distinguish between the types of diaspora around the world, Indian diaspora around the world, and the more important, you should be able to highlight the role of India's diaspora in India's foreign policy at critical junctures, the Pokhran test, the civil nuclear deal, and all of that. And then most importantly, you should be able to highlight the double-edged nature of Indian diaspora, right? And then like you should be able to say like India should institutionalize its engagement with the diaspora, foreign minister should help, and all of that, right? So you understand what is the requirement, right? Then there is something called an Open Skies Treaty. It's an interesting treaty, all right? We recently heard that Russia will exit the Open Skies Treaty in a matter of days, and the foreign ministry recently announced that. Right? Under the treaty, a country is bound to give a 6 months notice. So the notice period has sort of begun, and Russian leaders have 6 months to change their mind. And then the timing of this is very important and critical, right? Like a day before Joe Biden's inauguration. So there is some mixed messaging there also, right? So the first and foremost, what is the treaty, right? Under this treaty, there are some right, okay, let's go according to the plan, right? So each state party can conduct what is called a short notice unarmed reconnaissance flights over other countries' entire territory, right? So if there are two parties to that treaty, one country could get into, the people from one country officially can get into a plane and sort of conduct reconnaissance flights over the other country's territory, right? Sounds a little counterintuitive if you are adversaries, but that's the exact idea, right? To build trust, right? Because what happens is that under certain circumstances, when one country starts mobilizing troops, the other country also starts mobilizing troops, and then that becomes like a serious scene, right? A flashpoint. Any miscalculation on any country's part could sort of plunge the scenario into a war or like a proper conflict, right? So it's a trust building measure that you can bring on your planes, fly over my territory, see I have no intentions of attacking you. we can do the same, right? That's the idea of this, right? So observation aircraft must be equipped with sensors that enable the observing party to identify significant military equipment such as artillery, fighter aircraft, armored combat vehicles, right? Now this, all right, let's move on. This sort of information actually could be gathered from satellites. All right, United States satellites are famously very efficient at gathering this sort of data, right? But the Russian satellites can't, right? Or we believe so, right? So many other countries don't have those sort of capabilities. So it was a very generous initiative on part of the United States, right? To say you can come over our territory, see we are not doing anything, chill out, and we can do the same, right? So the treaty is a confidence building measure and enables familiarity among state parties through their participation in the overflights, right? And one thing that it also does is that it engages military personnel from different countries, right? It sort of builds this trust level, relationships are built, and so when at a later stage relationships between two countries become tense, it is these relationships that were built during these reconnaissance flights that become handy in passing messages to each other and sort of engaging at some level, right? So this is a very important part, right? And the key feature here is that you need to give a prior notice of 72 hours and you have to share the exact flight path at least 24 hours before the reconnaissance flight, right? So how did it come about? President Eisenhower in 1955 recommended this to Moscow that we should have this sort of a system, but Moscow was too worried about the US spying, so it sort of was dead on arrival. Then George W. Bush, the senior, right, the H.W. Bush, in the 1990s revived the idea, and the landmark treaty was signed in 1992 between the NATO members and the former Warsaw Pact, the Eastern European and Soviet Union, these countries, right? They signed the treaty, the 35 countries, including Kyrgyzstan, which did not ratify the treaty. It came into effect in 2002, all right? Now, last year, United States has already left, by the way, right? Why? Because it accused Russia of serious non-compliance. It said that Russia does not cooperate when its reconnaissance flights are flying over its region. In fact, during the Ukraine crisis, when Russia sort of invaded Crimea, it was these reconnaissance flights that were very useful in ensuring that the Russia stayed within limits, right? These flights were surveillance flights were critical, all right? Then there was a very funny report in the New York Times in 2017 that when Donald Trump was playing golf, he was not playing golf at that time, but in one of his golfing estates in New Jersey, the Russian flight sort of flew over his golfing estate, right? So that created quite a bit of friction. And then in May 2020, the Trump administration gave notice, that 6-month notice, and we are leaving the treaty because Russia has been flagrantly and consistently violating the provisions. All right, then why is Russia leaving? So as I told you, Russia really needed these flights because it doesn't have satellite capabilities as advanced as United States, and United States could do the same thing with its satellite capabilities. It's more about the relationships that you build, the trust building measure, but Russia really wanted to be a part of that treaty, and it really tried to hold on to the treaty up till now. But instead it sought security guarantees from European countries or countries in that region, saying that whatever intelligence that you gather from these surveillance flights over Russia, you will not share with the United States because they are not part of the treaty, right? But European countries could not give Russia that guarantee, right? Because they're part of a military, it's a transatlantic military alliance, means sharing intelligence and equipment and infrastructure, right? So because that security guarantee was not forthwith, they sort of said we are going to leave, and this withdrawal will take place the day before Joe Biden leaves office. He has 6 months to patch this deteriorating infrastructure under this treaty back, right? He has 6 months. So let's see what happens with respect to that, right? The greater geopolitical point here is that the liberal internationalist security infrastructure, the arms control infrastructure that was sort of that became the key part of ensuring that states don't arm themselves. There's no excessive militarization of the sort that we saw during the Cold War and before both the world wars. That sort of excessive militarization doesn't happen, because like militarization in one country begets militarization in another country. Ensuring that doesn't happen, countries actually spend on economies and education and all of that. There was some arms control agreement. There was a liberal internationalist arms control architecture. People say that is slowly unraveling, and the pace was just hastened by Donald Trump, right? So now you know that Open Skies Treaty is under serious jeopardy. There is an Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF Treaty, that regulates certain kinds of ballistic missiles up to a certain payload and up to a certain range. That has been sort of like Russia left it in, US and Russia left it in 2019. Then there is a START treaty, right? New START treaty, which again regulates like missiles of a certain long range, right? So it's between United States and Russia. Its expiry is due in February 2021. So we are expecting that could also unravel, right? So what impact does this unraveling have on India? Because this is a global good, that one country shall not militarize excessively, so that other country does not militarize excessively, and you can sort of spend on more productive aspects of your economy. India has been a beneficiary of this, right? India has been a beneficiary of this architecture. Now this unraveling is going to force India to arm itself to extents that were not like as much earlier. So India will have to sort of arm itself again and spend a lot on its military infrastructure, which it already does, right? So that it's going to be harmful to India in that way. And then the bigger geopolitical headache that India has is going to be choosing between Russia and United States, right? So India was in some sort of a pseudo alliance with Russia in the 70s and 80s. We were more dependent on Russia for our military cooperation and ensure it was some sort of a security guarantee that we had. No country could attack India without Russia ensuring that India had the capability to fight back. We now have that sort of a relationship with the United States, right? So we're pivoting from Russia to United States international relations, and we don't want to choose between them, right? Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, when he went to Russia in 2016, 17, I'm not sure, he said that if you ask any child in India who's their best friend, they're going to say Russia, who's the country's best friend. However, that reality might be changing a little, right? So there's this shift that we are seeing, and there will be flashpoints where we might be forced to make a decision, right? We might be forced to take a side, and we've already sort of had that, right? The S-400 missiles, right? We decided to buy them from Russia. We openly declared that we're going to buy them from Russia because it is a critical missing piece in our defensive architecture. So United States said, like, we're going to impose sanctions upon any country that does that, right? CAATSA, Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, right? Or Terrorist Sanctions Act. So we are right there within the ambit of that legislation. We've somehow managed to escape sanctions under that legislation. But you see, and then there's an Indo-Pacific idea, right? Indo-Pacific idea, we've been trying to rope in Russia into the Indo-Pacific idea. Russia has not been like coming by easily, right? We are somehow engaging with Russia in the Far East, right? We're saying let's have something going, right? And we are not even buying Russian arms and ammunition to that extent as we were earlier, right? So we might be forced into making a choice. And this unraveling of international security architecture is just going to make things worse for India, right? Then takeaways, I think I've sort of discussed them already. The international liberal security architecture is unraveling. The last of the functioning treaties have sort of stopped working. There is this new START that still remains. India has been a beneficiary of this global order. Great powers are digging in and going into that trench warfare mentality that we're going to militarize. India will also have to sort of follow suit. And this unraveling will make the world an unsafer place, and because the world will be a little unsafer, India might be dragged into an alliance with United States if this continues to happen, because we want to ensure our security also. Now there's this speculation as to why United States was so eager to leave, right? Not just the fact that it blamed Russia for violating the terms of the treaty. The problem that the United States has is that in many of these treaties, their contemporary adversary, China, is not a part of these treaties, right? So China is not bound by the same limitations that United States is in terms of what sort of architecture, security equipment that it wants to maintain, right? So it initially actually asked Russia to ensure that China gets into the picture. If China got into these treaties, then the security environment might have come to some sort of a safe end, right? Then China would have asked for India to be a part of that regime, and India would have asked Pakistan to be a part of the regime. So it's either global or nothing, right? So that's the equation that we're looking at. All right. So then let's move on to India-Oman relations, right? It's a very important relationship. Oman is India's oldest security partner in defense partner in West Asia, right? You should broadly know the geography of this area. This is the Arabian Peninsula. This is Oman. This is the Gulf of Oman, Persian Gulf, right? Muscat, which is their capital, is literal to the Persian Gulf. And then there is this very critical port of Dukm here, right? On the shores of the Arabian Sea, right? So you should know this geography, right? Then Oman has been part of the India's trading network for 5,000, 6,000 years, right? From the Harappan civilization onwards. Spices, textiles, jewelry were the primary equipment that was being traded here, right? Then why is this in news? Why India-Oman relationship is news? Because of this India-Oman Strategic Consultative Group is very important, right? You're going to mention this if you have to write an answer on India-Oman relationships, right? It was held with the first high-level official visit from Oman to India since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So what's the background? As I've discussed, there's geography, there's history, and there's culture that sort of unites Oman, that sort of brings Oman to India, right? There is excessive people-to-people contact. We got into a strategic partnership with them in 2008, and Oman has been a key pillar of India's West Asia policy, all right? What are the sort of political relations we are looking at? We exchange high-level visits pretty frequently. Oman, by the way, the Sultanate of Oman is an important interlocutor on platforms such as Gulf Cooperation Council, Arab League, and Indian Ocean Rim Association. So, in these platforms, Oman sort of looks after India's interests to an extent, right? So Oman is that close a partner, all right? Generally, India is very unlucky in the case that whenever there is a critical part of our region which is very important to our security, we tend to find adversaries there. Oman, we have been lucky in that sense, all right? Oman has been a good, harmless little partner harmless partner that has been actively aiding us in our security efforts, all right? Up till now, the most important part of our relationship with Oman has always been the economic and financial one, right? Oman invests in India. India is the third largest source for Oman's imports and all of that, right? Very important as a trading partner. Now, with the onset of Chinese aggression in the Indian Ocean, right, with China becoming this really important threat to India, Indian Navy has been trying to sort of project its power in Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean, and Oman is a key piece of that puzzle, right? Oman, this Dukm port, I don't know if this is very visible to you, but you could Google the location. So what it does is that it's a deep sea port. It allows ships from Indian Navy to dock there and sort of extend their reach deep into the Gulf of Aden and the Eastern African region and into the Persian Gulf, right? So it's a critical port, right? Port of Dukm, right? Oman being the oldest defense partner of India in the region, access to Dukm port is not difficult to get, and we have access, and it has intensified India's engagement with Oman on the strategic front. So as soon as China gets into the picture, our relationship with Oman gets a security perspective also, besides the trade and financial perspective, right? So there is a joint military cooperation committee which sort of ensures that we continuously keep on engaging with each other, right? Al-Najah is the army exercise, Eastern Bridge is the air force exercise, and Nashim al-Basar is the naval exercise, all right? So since 2008, Oman has been extending support to India Navy's anti-piracy missions. Indian Navy's anti-piracy missions in those regions have been very prominent. All right, there was a maritime pact between Omani and Indian Navy that was signed in 2008 that allowed India to gain logistics support on a long-term presence in the region, right? So then let's come to trade and commerce. Now that you've understood the defense part of it, India is the third largest source for Omani imports and third largest market for its non-oil exports, right? So India is critical for them. So whenever the global oil prices are at the lower end of the spectrum, the non-oil exports for this economy become very important, right? So India is that safe haven for Oman, right? India and a bunch of other countries, right? Then there was a commercial maritime transport pact that was signed in 2019, which will further facilitate it as it has up till now, right? So you should broadly know the trade basket. You're not required to remember what items are traded, but you should broadly have an idea as to what exactly is being traded. All right. So we're quickly going to read through this. All right. So major items of India's exports to Oman are mineral fuels, mineral oils, distillation products, boilers, machinery, mechanical appliances, important one, articles of iron and steel, electrical machinery and equipment, textiles, garments, chemicals, tea, coffee, spices, garments. Textiles are 5,000 years old, including jewelry and all of that. And then iron and steel is the modern equivalent of the same trade, right? And India's imports from Oman include pretty much the same thing. Mineral oils and bituminous substances and distilleries and all of that, right? The close cooperation with Oman is very important, all right? And you don't really get an idea of how close this is until you sort of get to know this, right? Financial institutions such as State Bank of India, public sector undertakings such as Air India, LIC have presence in Oman, right? Indian companies have invested in Oman in iron, steel, cement, fertilizers, textiles. There's this India-Oman Joint Investment Fund, which channels investment from Oman into India and ensures that it gets to specific sectors where it's most needed, where it's most profitable. And then there is this access to Dukma port that has become really critical, right? The port is Dukma's special economic zone, it is, and it's earmarked to be Indian Ocean's largest deep sea port, right? You understand how important this is. There's an agreement between India and Oman to develop an integrated tourism complex in Dukma, which is worth $748 million. So India is heavily investing in that port. Right, to sort of give you the locations of two of these very important ports. There is Salalah and then there is Dukma, right? Some people pronounce it as Salalah. I was trying to figure out what the pronunciation is. It's either Salalah or Salalah and Dukma, right? So Dukma here and Muscat here. Again, like this entire shoreline is very important for India's interests, all right? So as we've discussed diaspora point, like in the initial part of this, the Indian diaspora in Oman is pretty critical, right? So generally, I've told you there's a broad categorization of diaspora as to like highly skilled people in North America and Europe and less skilled people in West Asia. Oman is different. There are very highly qualified professionals like doctors, engineers, and so in Oman, right? So and like less skilled people also, right? So the people who are in Oman, persons of Indian origin, are spread over the entire spectrum of professionals, all right? There are many Indian schools, there are many CBSC schools in Oman. I know some people from there, right? And there are about 45,000 Indian students in Oman studying under CBSC curriculum, all right? So what's the way forward? Energy resources is important, right? India's energy demand from Oman is important, and Oman could be important there. Then the security element of it, China. We should continuously work with Oman to ensure that the security element is consolidated, that India and Omani naval forces sort of interact with each other seamlessly as if it doesn't matter whose navy it is, right? Dukma port, I've discussed this with you. All right, so that's it. That's how we should approach it. And I think you pretty much understood there's this economic component of it, the diaspora component of it, and the security component of it, right? And the fact that you must highlight that it's our oldest security partner in West Asia, historical links and all of that, all right? And you could draw a map to sort of tell the evaluator that you know what you're talking about, all right? So I hope you have a good day. Keep reading your newspapers. and drop your questions in the comments. And thank you so much for paying attention. Bye-bye.